Dalacqua, and I lead UNIDIR's Gender and Disarmament program. We work to support diplomats in bridging arms control and gender frameworks. The first thing I would like to say is that gender does not equal woman. So women and gender are not synonyms. When we talk about gender, we're actually talking about roles, responsibilities, behaviors, attributes associated with being a man or a woman, a girl or a boy or a non-binary person at a given time in a given context. So these are socially constructed characteristics that a society considers appropriate for a man or a woman. In this sense, they are not the same as biological sex, and they can be changed and they can evolve and throughout time and in different contexts. So in most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences and inequalities, and that's why we need to talk about gender equality. And that is why we talk about women's rights and roles, but the gender conversation should not only be about women alone. So far, there have been two main ways of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament. The first one is the most common one, is to look at who's sitting at the table, and you will notice that they are mostly men. So diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament have throughout time been mostly men. Women are underrepresented in this field of diplomacy much more than in other fields, let's say human rights, social, cultural affairs. And we know that because we at UNIDIR, we have looked at the lists of participants of more than 80 multilateral meetings on arms control and disarmament, and we compiled the information about gender balance across different forums on arms control and disarmament, and it can be found in this publication. It's also on our website. What we learned is that women represent on average 30% of the diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament, and that goes from conventional weapons to weapons of mass destruction to security technology, let's say cybersecurity discussions. So that's across the board. The other thing we learned is that in smaller groups, let's say working groups or technical committees, the number of women is even less. It's even smaller, so women tend to comprise 20% of, when the delegations are smaller, when the country can only send one representative for an arms control negotiation, they most likely send a man. So in smaller settings, women are usually 20% of the diplomats, and that tells us something else. It tells us about the role women are occupying. They are not, the challenge is even bigger at leadership positions. So again, women as heads of delegations to arms control and disarmament negotiations, it's on average 20%. This means there is a lot that should be done and can be done in terms of bringing gender equality into arms control and disarmament. If we don't do anything at the rate of the current pace, it will take two decades to reach gender parity at the working level, and only in 2065 we calculated that's when we would have gender balance among heads of delegations. So this means taking targeted action to give women more speaking roles, making sure women get a chance to participate and shape the outcomes of the conversations and deliberations. So this is, like we say, track one of bringing gender into arms control. It's to look at representation, participation, and meaningful participation. The second way of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament is actually what we call applying a gender lens to the substance of the discussion. So is to look at how gender roles, gender norms, attributes can impact women and men in a certain context, in the context of armed violence and conflict. For instance, if gender identity leads you to, puts you at more risk or influence how you're gonna access medical help, medical care, or it changes the way you'll be targeted by a certain weapon system or not. So this is what UNIDIR does. We do research to understand gender dynamics and in context of armed violence and conflict, and how that can be translated into arms control measures. And this may seem kind of a novel approach, but actually it has been done for some time already. A good example of bringing gender into arms control is the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty. So based on the knowledge that we have, that actually men are the largest proportion of direct casualty of small arms, but actually women are impacted by gender-based violence facilitated by such arms. So based on this knowledge, negotiators included a clause in the ATT mandating that states parties assess the risk that exported material will be used to facilitate gender-based violence. And this is one example, but if you look also at the action plans of the Mine Ban Treaty, the Cluster Munition Convention, the Treaty on the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition, they all have clauses mandating gender-sensitive assistance. And if you look also at the first committee resolutions, we have seen an increasing number of resolutions, including gender language. Last year, we estimate that a third of the resolutions adopted contained gender-relevant language.
How does gender relate to arms control and disarmament? Gender refers to the attributes that a society considers the norm for women and men, girls and boys, as well as non-binary or gender-fluid persons. In most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences and thus inequalities. When it comes to international forums concerned with peace and security, women are frequently underrepresented. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council approved a resolution that called for increased participation of women in peace and security decision-making. Nearly 20 years later, women make up only a third of the diplomats in arms control and disarmament forums. Still, there is hope. In 2018, the United Nations Secretary-General's Agenda for Disarmament called for the equal participation of women and men in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security. Women as well as men have the right to shape the outcomes of decisions that will affect their lives. But we must go beyond representation alone and ensure women can meaningfully influence decision-making. The truth is, gender norms shape how weapons are seen and used in society, as well as the impacts of weapons and violence. By applying a gender lens, we can begin to see how arms control and disarmament affect all segments of the population differently. Gender analysis is growing in recognition and has already inspired multilateral actions through a number of treaties and resolutions. UNIDIR is committed to gender equality as a key instrument of peace and security. Help us effectively integrate gender perspectives in disarmament discussions so we can ensure that everyone's security needs are properly addressed and make gender equality a reality for all.
So I'll give you three main reasons. The first one is connected to what I was saying before, is that knowledge of gender dynamics and gender disaggregated data can actually be translated into practical arms control measures and can make arms control more effective and help arms control and disarmament redress gender inequalities in the context of armed violence and conflict. The second question, it's because it's a matter of equality. It's a recognition that women and men have the same right to participate and shape the outcomes of decisions in any given area of policy or diplomacy, and arms control and disarmament is one of that area. And the third point is that you know that gender issues have been quite high on the public agenda in the media and have, featured in many mobilizations we've seen recently, the Me Too movement and more action towards gender equality. So I think also bringing gender into arms control and disarmament has the potential to engage more the general public. We often hear, "Oh, people are not interested in arms control and disarmament. What should we do?" And I think that actually can serve as a hook to bring more people on board, get the general public interested and engaged in arms control matters.
Recognizing the active and necessary role that women play in decision-making to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, the United Nations General Assembly approved Resolution 6569 on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control in 2010. To date, 6 additional resolutions have been approved to establish a path towards equitable participation on these issues. In 2018, the United Nations Secretary-General launched the Disarmament Agenda with the purpose of revitalizing disarmament issues on the multilateral agenda. The agenda establishes practical measures distributed through 4 fundamental pillars. The first pillar aims to prevent and eliminate weapons of mass destruction. The second pillar has the mission of reducing and mitigating the impact of conventional weapons in a highly armed world. The third pillar highlights the need for the world of politics and the scientific and technological sectors to establish lines of actions to face these new threats. The fourth pillar implies involving alliances between the different actors in society. The increase in the participation of Latin American and Caribbean women in disarmament-related themes encourages the creation of new policies related to disarmament, which promotes sustainable development free from violence and with gender equality.
Let me start by thanking UNODA and UNIDIR to offer me the opportunity to shortly present the ICRC and our work for this disarmament orientation course. My name is Laurent Giselle, and I'm the head of the Arms and Conductor Facilities within the legal division of the ICRC, and leading notably all our work on humanitarian disarmament. In the next few minutes, I will briefly talk about the International Committee of the Red Cross, our work and mandate to protect and assist victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence. And then I will focus on our work with regard to international humanitarian law and humanitarian disarmament, and that second part will be the bulk of my talk. So first, with regards to the International Committee of the Red Cross, so work or mandate. The ICRC is an impartial, neutral, and independent organization, and our exclusively humanitarian mission and mandate is to protect the lives and dignities of victims of armed conflicts and other situations of violence, and to alleviate their suffering. We are present in over 100 countries worldwide with 20,000 staff. The ICRC also endeavors to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law and universal humanitarian principles. The mandate that I just described was given to us by the international community, by all states, through a resolution of the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. The ICRC has been established in 1863, and we are at the origin of the Geneva Conventions and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And we collaborate closely with Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies on many, if not most, aspects of our work, including with regards to humanitarian disarmament. To work for the faithful implementation of international humanitarian law as part of our work, we do that through both preventative measures and protection work. Preventative measures include supporting states to adhere to IHL treaties and to support their implementation into domestic law. So we develop ratification kits and model national law, for instance. We also support militaries into developing training of international humanitarian law, so training curriculum for their armed forces. When conflicts are actually raging, we assess compliance with international humanitarian law. So we document instances of possible violations and we submit allegations to parties to the conflict, but also recommendations and in order to improve compliance. We do that in a bilateral confidential dialogue with states and non-state parties to armed conflicts. This work covers the full spectrum of international humanitarian law, from the rules governing the use of weapons and hostilities with a view to protect civilians, but also the rules on the protection of prisoners of war or the detainees that we visit to ensure human treatment, the effects of the conflict on environment, the protection against displacement, etc. Another aspect of our work is to try alleviating the suffering of the populations affected by armed conflict and other situations of violence by providing them with assistance in terms of food or other essential humanitarian relief items, to support hospitals, to work with local authorities, to repair or maintain critical infrastructure, to make sure that the delivery of essential services to the populations can continue despite the conflict. We work to reunite separated families and we do develop socioeconomic programs for populations affected by the conflict. And I could continue to list the type of activities that we do. This is an extremely important part of our work, actually the largest proportion by far in terms of budget, but that's not directly the focus of this introduction. So let me now move to the second part, where I will focus on our work with regards to international humanitarian law and humanitarian disarmament. So as I was saying before, we are mandated by the International Committee to work for the clarification, strengthening, and possible development by development of international humanitarian law. And by international humanitarian law, I mean both IHL per se, but as well humanitarian disarmament treaties and rules that are at the intersection between IHL and traditional disarmament. In this part, I will cover three aspects. First, international humanitarian law as such, then humanitarian disarmament, and then all role work with regards to humanitarian disarmament. So first, turning to international humanitarian law, and that's also known as the law of armed conflict, the law of war, or sometimes used in bello, that's all the same thing. It's based on the idea that even in armed conflict, there are limits to what it is lawful to do. In particular, the choice of weapons and means and methods of warfare by the belligerents is not unlimited. And with regards to weapons in particular, the law of armed conflict prohibits weapons that are indiscriminate by nature and that's aimed, first of all, to protect civilians. International humanitarian law also prohibits weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. And that principle and rule is primarily meant to protect combatants, though it, of course, also protects civilians. And IHL is also concerned with the protection of the natural environment, and it's notably prohibited to employ methods or means of warfare which are expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. The use of weapons that are not fully prohibited is limited by many rules, and I'm sure you all know of the cardinal principle of distinction that inform all rules governing the conduct of hostilities, but also the prohibition of indiscriminate and disproportionate attack, and all the rules with regards to taking precautions in attack with a view to avoid or minimize incidental civilian harm. International humanitarian law contains also lots of detailed rules to protect wounded and sick and to protect the delivery of health care, so protecting hospitals and medical transport, to protect prisoners of war and other detainees, to protect populations in occupied territory, cultural property, etc., etc. International humanitarian law is at the basis of the most large part of international criminal law, because serious violations of international humanitarian law are war crimes. IHL is a very realistic body of law that is built on the experience of armed conflict and always strike a balance between military necessity and humanity. The main sources is that it's found in the 1949 Geneva Conventions and 1977 additional protocols, and a number of those rules have now become customary international law. You can find all the relevant treaties and the customary rules that we have identified on databases that are available on our website and through an app that we developed. Turning now to humanitarian disarmament treaties and rules. Over the last century and a half, states have agreed to prohibitions and to limitations of certain weapons already in use or of newly developed weapons even before their development, owing to the actual or potential human cost of those weapons. That's often based on treaties, but many of these prohibitions and limitations turned into customary prohibitions and limitations as well. And let me just list a few of them. Among the weapons that the use is today prohibited by treaty and or customary rules, that include exploding and expanding bullets, that includes chemical and biological weapons since a long time, that includes blinding laser weapons, anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions, and most recently nuclear weapons through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons adopted in 2017. With regard to weapons whose use is not entirely prohibited, but is limited, strictly limited, depending on the circumstances or the manner of use, that includes notably incendiary weapons. And then there are various rules with regards to explosive remnants of war that are very important, especially to enable, to avoid that explosive remnants of war continue killing people after hostilities have ended. And let me just mention finally the Arms Trade Treaty, which is very important in setting some standards with regard to transfer of weapons when there is the risk that those weapons may be expected to be used in violations of IHL, so to prevent that weapons ends up in the hands of those that might violate IHL in the first place. Now, I listed a number of weapons that are specifically prohibited or regulated, but all weapons, even those that are not specifically regulated, must comply with the general rules of international humanitarian law regarding weapons and conduct of hostility. And for instance, if a weapon that is not specifically prohibited is nevertheless indiscriminate by nature, or whether it may be expected to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, it is prohibited by the general rules and cannot be developed or used by states or by other parties to the conflict. Let me turn finally to our work with regard to weapons. And we focus, of course, at those weapons which raise particular concerns from a humanitarian perspective. Our work with regard to weapons is evidence-based. With regard to existing weapons, we document their effects in armed conflict. With regard to the research and development of new weapons technologies, we analyze their potential human cost. Our analysis is based on the technical characteristic of the weapons, so how it functions and its design-dependent effects. It's also based on the military perspective, the actual or potential humanitarian consequences that the weapons cause, and that's of course at the center of our assessment. And finally, on the ethical and legal challenges that those weapons raise. On the basis of this first-hand knowledge of the humanitarian consequences of weapons during armed conflict and or analysis of the compatibility of weapons with international humanitarian law and with ethical requirements, we also develop recommendations for states and the international community. And we share them notably through participating in the work of multilateral bodies working on weapons of concern, such as the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW, that is based here in Geneva, the work in the framework of the Convention on the Anti-Personnel Mine-Bind Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions here in Geneva, but also the work of the UN General Assembly First Committee in New York, and of course all the group of governmental experts or the open-ended working group that have been created by the International Committee. So in those groups and fora, we submit working paper, we participate actively during the sessions, and it will be a pleasure to meet you all regularly in and around these processes here in Geneva. We also, of course, workshops on issues of humanitarian concerns that gather government and independent experts from various fields to better analyze and inform our analysis of the weapons of humanitarian concerns. And we regularly publish the result of those research reports of the meetings we organized and other type of publications. The ICRC has played a key role in alerting states to the actual or potential humanitarian impact of most, if not all, of the weapons I mentioned above, including by directly appealing to states to agree new international rules to address this impact. Sometimes that takes a very long time, and nuclear weapons is the case in point. The International Committee of the Red Cross was the first international humanitarian organizations to arrive in Hiroshima after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we worked there alongside with the Japanese Red Cross. So we witnessed firsthand the catastrophic consequences of the use of those weapons, the sheer number of dead, wounded, the scale of the humanitarian consequences, the impossibility to treat them, and the long-term effects of those weapons on humans. So we called on states to prohibit nuclear weapons already in the autumn of 1945. And the TPNW was adopted in 2017, so quite a number of decades later. And while the number of state parties steadily grows, there is still a long way to have it universally adopted. Maybe more classical example is our work with regard of anti-personnel mines. Through our field hospitals, we documented the effects of these weapons on health and on civilians. And the data collected that way led our medical staff to characterize in clinical terms the widespread civilian casualties caused by anti-personnel mine as an epidemic. So this led to the ICRC calling in 1994, we called on states to ban anti-personnel mine and the campaign that followed afterwards. From a legal perspective, we questioned the acceptability of anti-personnel mines on the basis of the IHL principle of distinction and the prohibition of indiscriminate weapons and the prohibition to use weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. And we questioned the adequacy of the law that existed at the time to appropriately deal with the risk caused by AP mines, calling on states to develop the law further. We also work and sometimes call for the development of a policy framework governing weapons of concerns, and that's very much the case currently with regards to the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas. We have been witnessing the devastating humanitarian consequences of urban warfare over the last decade, and the main cause of civilian harm is definitely heavy explosive weapons when they are used in urban and other populated areas. So we researched that over several years, and many other organizations and states have also documented that. In January 2022, we published milestones regard that support or call on states to commit as a matter of policy to avoid the use of heavy explosive weapons in urban and other populated areas because the likelihood of indiscriminate effects. And there is now currently in spring 2022 a consultation process led by Ireland towards political declarations on explosive weapons, on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, to which we are participating actively. With regard to new technologies, it's where preventative work is at its best. Indeed, it's always better to prevent the suffering rather than to react to the use of unacceptable weapons. Maybe the best example is the prohibition of blinding laser weapons, a weapon that was being developed at the time but had been prohibited even before it has ever been used in combat. And that's, of course, the best when it comes to weapons that are unacceptable. So in this case, the international community managed to come to an agreement that those should not be developed, and that was very effective because they were never developed. In terms of new technologies, today in 2022, the most pressing issues in our perspective with regards to the development of new weapons technologies is the autonomous weapon systems. States have been discussing about autonomous weapon systems since 8 years now in the framework of the CCW and the group of governmental experts that the convention established. We have submitted recommendations to all states in May 2021 with a two-pronged approach to, on the one hand, prohibit unacceptable autonomous weapon systems, and we have identified two types of unacceptable autonomous weapon systems that are those which are unpredictable and those that would directly target people. And the second prong is to strictly limit all other autonomous weapon systems. So today, in spring 2022, we are encouraged by a growing convergence of view among states on the need for a legally binding instrument and a convergence of view towards a two-pronged approach of prohibitions and restrictions, such as the one that we recommended. Of course, there are also key questions in terms of new technologies with regard to the increased development of cyber capabilities and their use during armed conflict, as well as the question of outer space operations during armed conflict, and in both cases with regard to the potential human cost of using such operations. To conclude, let me stress that documentation of the effects of weapons in the field has been particularly important to feed into our legal and policy work on weapons. We work and we favor a transversal and multidisciplinary approach involving first-hand information by the International Committee of the Red Cross in the field in all the countries where we work around the world. All first-hand observation on the effects of weapons, including what we observe through our medical staff or weapon contamination experts. And this is complemented by the analysis from a technical, scientific, military, and legal and ethical perspective. We, of course, engage with states, with their governments and their militaries to hear their view and their concerns and perspective, and that's also inform our own analysis and recommendations. We welcome the opportunity to contribute our expertise to states bilaterally and in multilateral discussions, and remain gladly available to further engage on this matter with you and your governments as you deem most appropriate. So I wish you a great disarmament orientation course and look forward to working with you on humanitarian disarmament issue over the coming years. Thank you.
Disarmament and the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were agreed on by all United Nations member states in 2015. They are a blueprint for all states to work together to achieve a better, more sustainable future by 2030. As development, peace, and security are fundamentally connected, effective disarmament and arms control are vital for achieving these goals. We can see this most obviously in SDG 16 to promote just, peaceful and inclusive societies, with its specific target on significantly reducing illicit arms flows. But disarmament can be found throughout the goals. Armed violence is a leading cause of premature death and a key source of injuries, disability and psychological distress. Raising awareness about disarmament issues through education strengthens the building of peaceful societies. The safe and secure management of arms and ammunition stockpiles improves the safety and resilience of our cities. When disarmament efforts are gender responsive, they recognize the different impacts of weapons on women, men, girls, and boys. Contamination from remnants of war and the testing and use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons have disastrous environmental consequences. And excessive military spending diverts much needed economic resources, which could be used for sustainable development, peace, and security. When we think of disarmament and arms control in the wider sense of sustainable development, conflict prevention, and peace building, we are better prepared to tackle 21st century challenges and implement the 2030 Agenda.
And I will present the financial aspects of the 4 treaties supported by UNODA Geneva. I'm talking of the Anti-Personnel Landmines Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. We refer to them also as APLC, BWC, CCM, and CCW. These 4 conventions do not receive any funds from the regular budget of the United Nations. They are financed instead through assessed contributions from their states parties and states participating in their meetings. So, if you are a state party to any of these conventions, or if you plan to attend any of these meetings, this video is relevant to you because we are talking of your government's money and of the services that you will receive for them. This system of financing is called extra budgetary, and you will often hear that these conventions are funded through extra budgetary contributions. This means that all costs must be borne by the states parties to the conventions and states not participating therein, and that there cannot be any financial liability for the United Nations, either directly or indirectly. To determine how much each state should pay, the United Nations scale of assessment is used, adjusted to account for the differences in membership between the UN and the conventions. Among you, some states pay several thousand US$ towards these conventions, while others pay less than $100 a year. So how does this work? The states parties to each of these 4 conventions approve multiple years budgets for each of them. In the past, they would approve a 1-year budget, and now we have moved to a slightly different system. The approval of these budgets gives the Secretariat the authority to enter into contracts and incur expenditures during the agreed budget period. On the basis of these approved budgets, the United Nations can in fact cover the expenses related to the organization of the meetings, such as documentation, interpretation, and meeting services. For BWC and CCW, there are also costs associated with personnel, because these 2 conventions have implementation support units embedded in UNODA Geneva. These costs are calculated before the meeting, and the invoices are sent to states based on an estimate. For the APLC and CCM, the implementation support units of the conventions are instead outside the United Nations and are funded through voluntary contributions. So where is the problem? The problem is that a certain number of states every year do not pay these invoices within the due date or do not pay them at all. Up to now, we have over 600,000 US dollars of payments overdue for more than 1 year. This was first and foremost a structural issue that pertained to the financing of the conventions. There was no mechanism to cover the unpaid debts, and the UN was left with the debt. This situation was obviously unsustainable, and in 2019, the UN decided to do something about it. And doing something about it meant to stop closing the accounts of the conventions until all states had paid their contributions for a given year, or until new financial measures were adopted. As I speak to you now, BWC, CCW, and CCM have all adopted financial measures to overcome this issue. For APLC, the accounts remain still not closed pending the adoption of the new financial measures. Also, over the years, when the United Nations did not have cash available to run the meetings, these were cancelled or shortened. Other measures were also taken, such as the non-translation of some documents, which goes against the principle of multilingualism. This is clearly a liquidity issue caused by late payments and by the accumulation of unpaid contributions. That means that basically there is no money to enter into commitments. What does the United Nations need, you will ask? At the structural level, the United Nations needs states to adopt financial decisions that put in place backup structures for non-payments, such as contingency funds or working capital funds. Working capital funds have now been created for BWC and CCW, and APLC has a contingency fund. On the liquidity front, the United Nations needs to secure funds 3 months ahead of a meeting and needs to have these funds already in the bank before contracting interpreters, conference officers, or entering into commitments for the translation of documentation. And in situations where staff contracts are concerned, sufficient cash needs to be on hand before the contracts can be extended. And needless to say, the United Nations also needs some medium-term financial visibility and the ability to plan on the basis of enough existing resources. So what can be done? First and foremost, states should pay in full and on time and should consider measures to provide incentives to non-payers to pay in time and full. Ultimately, without sound financial rules that ensure the sustainability of the convention's machinery, there can be no adequate support to the many activities that in principle states wish to maintain under these conventions. I refer not only to the meetings of states parties, but first and most importantly, to universalization activities and to the necessary substantive and operational support in the implementation of these conventions. To provide cash to the secretariats to allow for the continuation of staff contracts where the ISUs are embedded in the United Nations, states could also voluntarily contribute to the working capital funds that have been created under both the Biological Weapons Convention and CCW. If we look at the structural level, you may be wondering what does it mean not to close the accounts? And I should start by telling you that the only treaty where the accounts are still not closed is APLC. In fact, all other treaties have adopted measures that will allow for the closure of accounts. Accounts remain not closed for APLC because UN rules, as I was mentioning at the beginning of this presentation, require the UN to refund states parties the difference between the original estimate and the actual cost of a meeting. This means that on closing of the annual accounts, the UN must give full credit to those states that have paid in full. However, non-payment by some states means that the organization must return funds that it does not have. And this covers both the option of returning funds in cash or in credit. The United Nations does not have the funds that have not been deposited. This situation, therefore, in the past, used to create unfunded liabilities and contravene the financial regulation rules of the organization. To stop this process, in 2019, the United Nations decided that it would delay closing the accounts until all states pay their contribution for a given year, or different financial measures were adopted. And this would avoid the UN being liable to give back to states money that it has not received. The collateral damage of this decision was that states that had paid their contribution in full and on time stopped receiving their credits, the credits that they were entitled to. This decision triggered new financial measures adopted under CCM and CCW in 2021 that now will allow for the closure of the accounts. Basically, these decisions request the calculation of credits due to states parties that have paid their contribution for a given financial year on the basis of the final cash balance, which means the funds that are available at a specific time, with the unfunded credits to be returned periodically as states in arrears progressively pay their outstanding invoices. I should mention that BWC was the first convention to adopt a similar decision before the decision to close the accounts in 2019. The dialogue with states to sensitize them to the financial difficulties faced by the conventions started in 2015. We do appreciate the efforts that states have put into this issue, and we start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Yet, there is no financial measure that can bypass the lack of payments on the part of states. There are also additional measures that have been taken to increase transparency and visibility of the financial situation. Firstly, UNODA, working with finances at UNOG, created a restricted access web page where it posts on a monthly basis the status of contributions received for each convention. Furthermore, thanks to the work of finance colleagues and IT colleagues, a financial dashboard was launched. This dashboard gives an immediate snapshot of the financial situation of each convention and tells the reader who among the states has paid and who is in arrears with its contributions. Thirdly, UNODA has been constantly working with all stakeholders, including first and foremost the presidents of respective conventions, to draft financial measures and to reach out to the states that are in arrears. Well, this is of course the key to solving all issues highlighted above, and it is very much in your hands. I will conclude here my short introduction to financial issues. We welcome your questions and we stand ready to assist you further. Thank you for your kind attention.